In the early hours of December 7, 1941, the Pacific Ocean was calm. The waters surrounding the Hawaiian Islands reflected a peaceful sky, giving no warning of the violence about to unfold. Sailors aboard American battleships slept in their bunks. Pilots prepared for routine training flights. Officers expected another quiet Sunday morning. Halfway across the Pacific, that calm already no longer existed. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers cut silently through the ocean, their decks crowded with planes armed for war. Hundreds of pilots sat in cramped cockpits, rehearsing their attack in their minds. They were not improvising. This moment had been planned for months, debated for years, and feared by those who understood what it truly meant. Japan was about to attack the United States. But the decision to strike Pearl Harbor did not begin with hatred, madness, or blind aggression. It began with fear, desperation, and a belief that Japan's survival as a great power was slipping away. To understand why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, you must first understand Japan's position in the world in the early 20th century. Japan was not a resource-rich nation. It possessed little oil, limited iron, and almost no rubber. What it did have was a rapidly growing population, an expanding industrial economy, and an empire that believed its destiny was to dominate Asia. Since the late 1800s, Japan had modernized at astonishing speed, transforming from a feudal society into a powerful military state. Victory over China in 1895 and Russia in 1905 convinced Japanese leaders that they had earned their place among the great powers. But power came with a price. By the 1930s, Japan's economy was dependent on imports, especially oil. Its navy and air force ran almost entirely on fuel purchased from foreign nations, above all, the United States. Every Japanese battleship, aircraft, and tank depended on American oil to function. At the same time, Japan was at war. In 1937, Japan invaded China, launching a brutal conflict that would last 8 years. The war consumed enormous resources and became increasingly unpopular abroad. Reports of massacres, bombings of civilians, and atrocities reached the West. The United States condemned Japan's actions and began supporting China diplomatically and economically. Japan's military leadership, however, believed retreat was impossible. Withdrawal from China would mean humiliation. It would mean admitting that years of sacrifice had been wasted. Worse, it would mean weakness, something Japan's military culture could not accept. The Army and Navy believed that Japan's survival depended on expansion, not compromise. This belief put Japan on a collision course with the United States. As Japan expanded across Asia, American patience ran out. In response to Japanese aggression, the U.S. imposed a series of economic sanctions. Steel exports were restricted. Aviation fuel sales were reduced. Then, in July 1941, the United States froze Japanese assets and cut off oil exports entirely. For Japan, this was a death sentence delivered on paper. Without oil, Japan's reserves would last less than 2 years, possibly as little as 18 months. After that, the Navy would be immobilized. Aircraft would be grounded. The empire would collapse without a single shot fired. Japanese leaders faced an impossible choice. They could submit to American demands, withdraw from China, and accept a diminished role in Asia, or they could fight. Negotiations continued throughout 1941, but both sides spoke past one another. The United States demanded full withdrawal from China. Japan demanded recognition of its empire. Neither side was willing to bend. Behind closed doors in Tokyo, Japan's military leadership reached a grim conclusion. War with the United States was likely inevitable. If war was coming, Japan believed it had only one chance: strike first, strike hard, and cripple American power in the Pacific before the United States could bring its vast industrial strength to bear. The American Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, stood in the way. Pearl Harbor was more than a naval base. It was the symbol of American power in the Pacific, a collection of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft that could block Japanese expansion south toward the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. As long as the fleet existed, Japan could not safely seize the resources it desperately needed. The idea of attacking Pearl Harbor was radical, risky, and deeply controversial. Even within Japan, many officers believed it was madness to provoke the United States. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, understood American industrial capacity better than most. He had lived in the United States and knew its potential. Yamamoto famously warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but could not win a long war against America. Yet Yamamoto also understood something else. If war was inevitable, Japan's only hope lay in a devastating opening blow that might shock the United States into negotiating. Pearl Harbor was not meant to win the war. It was meant to buy time. The plan that emerged was unprecedented in naval history. Japan would launch a surprise carrier-based air attack across thousands of miles of ocean. It would strike without warning, destroy the American battleship fleet, and retreat before the United States could respond. The goal was to remove American interference long enough for Japan to fortify its new empire and force a negotiated peace. Japanese pilots trained relentlessly for the mission. They practiced torpedo drops in shallow water. They studied photographs of Pearl Harbor's layout. Every detail was rehearsed. Secrecy was absolute. Even many Japanese sailors did not know where they were going until the fleet was already underway. Radio silence was enforced. The carriers approached Hawaii from the north, an unexpected direction believed to be safe from detection. As dawn approached on December 7th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted from the decks. They flew low over the ocean, engines steady, weapons armed. Below them, Pearl Harbor slept. What happened next would change the course of everything. Japan did not wake up one morning and decide to attack the United States. Pearl Harbor was the end of a long road, shaped by fear, ambition, pride, and desperation. To understand why Japan struck the American Pacific Fleet, you have to step into the mindset of Japan's leaders in the late 1930s, a nation that believed its survival depended on expansion, and that war with the United States was becoming unavoidable. Japan was not a poor or backward country by 1940. It was an industrial power, a modern navy state, and one of the most disciplined military societies on Earth. But it was also deeply vulnerable. Japan lacked oil. It lacked iron ore. It lacked rubber. It lacked food. Nearly everything that fueled its factories, ships, and aircraft had to be imported. And most of those imports came from one place, the United States. That dependency terrified Japan's military planners. Since the Meiji Restoration, Japan had followed one guiding principle: never allow itself to be dominated by foreign powers the way China had been. The humiliation of Western imperialism in Asia haunted Japanese leaders. They believed that only a strong empire could guarantee Japan's independence. This belief pushed Japan toward expansion on the Asian mainland. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. In 1937, it launched a full-scale war against China. What was supposed to be a quick victory turned into a brutal, endless conflict that drained resources and manpower. By 1940, Japan was bogged down in China with no clear exit, and its appetite for resources only grew. The solution, in the eyes of Japan's military, was the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. On paper, it was a vision of Asia liberated from Western colonial rule. In reality, it was an empire, one that would place Japan at the center and provide the oil, rubber, tin, and food it desperately needed. Southeast Asia, especially the Dutch East Indies, held massive oil reserves, but there was a problem. Those territories were controlled by Western powers. To reach them, Japan would have to challenge Britain, the Netherlands, and inevitably the United States. At first, Japan hoped it could expand without fighting America, but its actions made that impossible. The United States watched Japan's war in China with growing alarm. Reports of atrocities, including the massacre at Nanking, shocked American public opinion. While the U.S. was officially neutral, it began applying pressure in other ways. Economic pressure. In 1939, the U.S. terminated its commercial treaty with Japan. In 1940, it banned the export of aviation fuel and scrap metal. Then came the decisive blow. In July 1941, after Japan occupied French Indochina, the United States froze Japanese assets and cut off oil exports entirely. This was catastrophic for Japan. Without American oil, Japan's reserves would last about 18 months, less if war broke out. Every ship, every aircraft, every tank depended on fuel. Without oil, Japan's empire would collapse without a single battle being fought. Japan now faced a stark choice: back down and abandon its empire in China, or go to war to seize the resources it needed. Backing down was unthinkable. For Japan's military leaders, retreat meant national humiliation, loss of face, and the possible collapse of the government. Many believed surrendering gains in China would eventually reduce Japan to a second-rate power, vulnerable to Western domination. So the decision shifted from whether to fight to how to fight. Japan knew it could not defeat the United States in a long war. American industrial capacity dwarfed Japan. If war dragged on for years, Japan would lose. The only chance was to strike first, hard enough to shock the United States into negotiating. This belief was rooted in Japan's experience fighting Russia in 1904. A sudden, decisive naval victory had forced a great power to the negotiating table. Japanese planners hoped history would repeat itself. Their goal was not to conquer America. Their goal was to cripple it long enough to secure Southeast Asia and fortify a defensive perimeter, so strong that the U.S. would accept a compromise peace. To do that, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had to be neutralized. And that fleet was anchored at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was both a symbol and a threat. After moving the Pacific Fleet from California to Hawaii in 1940, the United States signaled that it intended to block Japanese expansion. From Pearl Harbor, American battleships could strike Japanese supply lines and interfere with operations in Southeast Asia. As long as the fleet existed, Japan's southern advance was at risk. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood this better than anyone. Yamamoto had studied in the United States. He knew America's strength. He warned Japan's leaders repeatedly that war would be disastrous if it dragged on. But once the political decision for war was made, he focused on one thing: delivering a blow so severe that America would hesitate. Yamamoto's idea was radical. Instead of waiting for the U.S. Navy to come west, Japan would strike east. Aircraft carriers, still a relatively new weapon, would launch a surprise attack across thousands of miles of ocean. Battleships would be targeted in harbor before they could fight back. Many in the Japanese Navy thought the plan was reckless. Pearl Harbor was shallow, torpedoes might fail, carriers would be exposed. If surprise was lost, the entire strike force could be annihilated. But Yamamoto insisted. "If we must fight," he reportedly said, "I will run wild for 6 months." By late 1941, negotiations between Japan and the United States were collapsing. Japan demanded recognition of its dominance in Asia. The U.S. demanded withdrawal from China. Neither side would budge. Japan finalized its war plans. The attack on Pearl Harbor was timed to coincide with invasions across the Pacific, Malaya, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies. Pearl Harbor was not the beginning of the war. It was meant to be the knockout punch that made the rest possible. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft rose from 6 carriers and flew toward Hawaii. Their pilots believed they were striking a necessary blow for their nation's survival. What they did not know was that they had just guaranteed the very outcome Yamamoto feared most: a long, total war against an industrial giant that would never forgive the attack. Pearl Harbor was not a mistake of tactics. It was a mistake of assumptions. Japan assumed America would negotiate. America chose to fight. The attack itself was a tactical success and a strategic disaster. In just under 2 hours, the Japanese strike force devastated Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Hundreds of sailors were killed before they ever reached their stations. From a purely military perspective, it looked like a triumph. But the most important targets were missing. The American aircraft carriers were not in port. Japan had struck the fist, but not the arm. Within hours, the United States understood exactly what had happened. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of war. The attack unified a nation that had been deeply divided about entering the conflict. Isolationism died at Pearl Harbor. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress. He did not speak in rage. He spoke with cold certainty. The United States would fight, and it would fight until victory was complete. Japan's leaders had expected outrage. They had not expected resolve. In Tokyo, the mood was cautiously optimistic. The early reports were glowing: battleships sunk, aircraft destroyed, American power shattered at least temporarily. Japan's southern operations advanced rapidly. British forces fell back in Malaya. Singapore would soon collapse. The Philippines were cut off. For a moment, Japan's gamble seemed to be working. But the clock was already ticking. American shipyards went into overdrive. Damaged battleships were refloated, repaired, and returned to service. New carriers slid down the ways faster than Japan could imagine. Factories shifted overnight from civilian to wartime production. Japan had planned for a short war. The United States prepared for a long one. Japan's strategy after Pearl Harbor was defensive: secure the perimeter, fortify islands, bleed the enemy, force negotiations. But the problem was geography. The Pacific was too vast. Japan's empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Every island required ships, fuel, aircraft, and men. Every supply line was vulnerable. Every loss was irreplaceable. The United States, meanwhile, learned quickly. By mid-1942, American carriers were already striking back. The Doolittle raid shocked Japan's leadership by proving the home islands were not untouchable. Then came Midway. At Midway, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, many of the same ships and pilots that had attacked Pearl Harbor. In a single battle, Japan lost the core of its offensive naval air power. Pearl Harbor had not crippled the United States. It had provoked it. Japan's leaders began to understand the magnitude of their decision. The war they hoped to avoid, a grinding industrial conflict, was now unavoidable. Every month favored America. Every loss hurt Japan more deeply. Why then did Japan still attack? Because from their perspective, doing nothing meant certain defeat. Japan's leaders believed the oil embargo was economic strangulation. They believed the United States intended to force Japan into submission without firing a shot. In their worldview, that was no different from war. Pearl Harbor was a preemptive strike born of desperation. It was a gamble made by men who believed honor demanded action, even if the odds were against them. The tragedy is that many of them knew the outcome. Admiral Yamamoto famously warned that Japan could win battles, but not the war. He understood America's industrial strength. He understood its resilience. But once the political decision was made, his duty was to execute it as effectively as possible. Pearl Harbor was executed brilliantly. It failed completely. Because wars are not won by surprise alone. They are won by endurance, resources, and the will to fight. Pearl Harbor ensured that the United States would fight with all three. In trying to secure its future, Japan sealed its fate. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not madness. It was logic, flawed, desperate logic, built on fear of dependence, fear of humiliation, and fear of decline. And it changed the course of history forever. Inside Japan, the decision to attack Pearl Harbor was not unanimous. It was the result of intense internal conflict between civilian leaders, military hardliners, and a generation of officers who believed compromise meant national suicide. Throughout 1941, Japan's government was paralyzed by contradiction. Diplomats still negotiated with Washington even as the military prepared for war. Messages crossed oceans while warships fueled and aircraft trained. Japan was talking peace while planning violence. Prime Minister Fumimaro Kano hoped for a diplomatic solution. He understood Japan could not defeat the United States in a prolonged war. But Kano was trapped. The Army and Navy held real power, and both were dominated by officers who believed Japan's destiny lay in expansion. When Kano failed to break the deadlock, he resigned. His replacement, General Hideki Tojo, was not a warmonger by nature, but he was a soldier bound by duty. Once he became prime minister, the machinery of war moved faster. Negotiations became a formality. The deadline for peace passed quietly. Japan's military culture left little room for retreat. Officers were taught that yielding to foreign pressure was dishonor. The concept of losing face carried enormous weight. To abandon China under American pressure would undermine the military's authority at home and destroy public confidence in the government. Tojo later admitted that Japan went to war knowing it could lose, but believing that not fighting was worse. The final decision came in early December 1941. The orders were issued, the fleet sailed, and diplomacy continued until the very last moment. Japan even prepared a message to Washington, intended to be delivered shortly before the attack. It was not a declaration of war. It was a notice that negotiations had ended. Due to delays and errors, it arrived after the bombs were already falling. This sealed Japan's image as a treacherous aggressor in American eyes. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor cannot be overstated. For Americans, it was a shock that transformed fear into unity. For Japanese civilians, it was initially a source of pride. Newspapers celebrated victory. Schoolchildren cheered. The empire seemed unstoppable. But victory carried a hidden cost. Japan had awakened an enemy whose economy alone outweighed the entire Axis combined. Within weeks, American war production exploded. Carriers replaced battleships as the core of naval warfare. Radar, code-breaking, and logistics reshaped how wars were fought. Japan, meanwhile, was already stretched thin. Its industrial base was limited. Its oil supply dwindled. Its pilot training pipeline could not replace losses. Pearl Harbor did not solve Japan's problems. It magnified them. Strategically, Japan made another fatal mistake. It underestimated American resolve. Japanese planners believed the United States was soft, divided, unwilling to endure casualties. They assumed Americans would prefer compromise to sacrifice. This misreading came from racial and cultural arrogance, reinforced by Japan's past victories. They were wrong. The attack hardened American attitudes permanently. There would be no negotiated peace, no limited war, only unconditional surrender. Japan had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. As the war dragged on, the consequences of Pearl Harbor echoed everywhere. Each island lost, each convoy sunk, each pilot killed. The empire Japan hoped to secure slowly collapsed under the weight of its own overreach. By 1944, American submarines were strangling Japan's economy, ironically using tactics Japan had ignored before the war. Oil tankers vanished, factories shut down, cities grew dark. Japan's leaders still clung to hope. They believed one more decisive battle might turn the tide, one final blow that would force negotiations. But Pearl Harbor had been their one chance at surprise, and it had failed to break America. By 1945, Japan faced devastation beyond anything imagined in 1941. Cities burned, the navy was shattered, the army bled out across Asia, and the war ended not with negotiation, but with annihilation. Pearl Harbor was the opening move in a tragedy driven by fear, pride, and miscalculation. It stands as a warning. A nation can win the first battle and still lose everything. To truly understand why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, it's important to strip away hindsight. The decision was not made by villains twirling mustaches or by leaders blind to reality. It was made by men operating inside a rigid system that rewarded aggression and punished restraint. Japan's military had gradually become the state. By the late 1930s, civilian politicians were effectively hostages to the army and navy. Cabinets could be toppled if the military withdrew its ministers. Assassinations of political figures in the early 1930s had sent a clear message: those who opposed expansion risked their lives. This created a culture where extreme decisions felt normal. Moderation became dangerous. Inside the Imperial Japanese Army, war was seen not only as policy but as purification. Conflict was believed to strengthen national spirit. Compromise weakened it. This worldview made peaceful withdrawal from China impossible, even when it became strategically disastrous. Every concession felt like betrayal. Meanwhile, Japan's navy viewed the United States as its inevitable enemy. War games conducted throughout the 1930s consistently showed that any conflict with America would hinge on the Pacific Fleet. If the fleet survived, Japan would lose. The Navy knew it could not win a prolonged carrier war, but it believed it might win a psychological one. Pearl Harbor was designed to shock American leadership, not just militarily, but emotionally. Japanese planners believed a sudden, devastating blow would make the war seem unwinnable to the U.S. public. They underestimated American anger. They also misunderstood American history. The United States had entered past wars reluctantly, but once committed, it fought with relentless determination. Japanese intelligence failed to grasp this pattern. Cultural bias led them to see American society as decadent, unwilling to suffer. Pearl Harbor proved the opposite. Another critical factor was time. Japan believed it was running out of it. Oil reserves were shrinking. Aircraft engines were wearing out. Training hours were cut to conserve fuel. If Japan waited too long, it would lose the ability to fight at all. The embargo forced action. In Japanese strategic thinking, delay meant surrender. So the attack on Pearl Harbor became framed not as aggression, but as self-defense. This mindset is difficult to accept today, but it was sincere. Japan believed America was trying to strangle it economically and politically. War was seen as the only remaining option. The tragedy is that alternatives did exist. Japan could have withdrawn from China. It could have accepted limits on expansion. It could have focused on economic development instead of empire. But those options were politically impossible inside Japan's militarized system. Pearl Harbor was not just a military strike. It was the result of years of unchecked ideology. When the attack failed to destroy American carriers, Japan lost its strategic advantage almost immediately. But the psychological die had already been cast. Japan could no longer step back without total humiliation. The war became existential, and existential wars rarely end well. As the Pacific War progressed, Japan doubled down on sacrifice. Kamikaze attacks, civilian mobilization, and scorched-earth defenses all traced their roots back to the same mindset that made Pearl Harbor possible, the belief that death was preferable to surrender. This belief would cost millions of lives. Pearl Harbor did not cause the Pacific War. It revealed it. It exposed the collision between two worldviews, one built on expansion through force, the other on industrial power and total mobilization. Only one could survive. And when the war finally ended, Japan emerged shattered but transformed. The militarism that drove the attack was dismantled. The empire dissolved. The nation rebuilt itself on entirely different foundations. Pearl Harbor remains a moment frozen in time, not because it was inevitable, but because it shows how nations can convince themselves that catastrophe is necessary. That is why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Not out of madness, but out of fear, pride, and the belief that there was no other path left. By 1945, the world that had produced Pearl Harbor no longer existed. The Empire Japan sought to protect through that single, desperate strike lay in ruins. Its navy had been sunk, its cities burned, its people starved. The very military culture that once celebrated decisive action had been ground down by attrition, isolation, and overwhelming force. And yet, to understand Pearl Harbor only through its ending is to misunderstand its beginning. Japan's leaders did not see themselves as villains in 1941. They saw themselves as guardians of national survival. They believed history had placed them in a narrowing corridor where every step backward meant submission and every step forward meant risk. Pearl Harbor was chosen because it seemed like the only move left on the board. This is the tragedy at the heart of the decision. Japan was not ignorant of America's strength. It was obsessed with it. Naval planners studied U.S. shipyards, factories, and population figures. They knew that if the war became industrial, Japan would lose. That knowledge did not stop the attack, it accelerated it. Pearl Harbor was a gamble made by men who believed that rational planning had failed, and only audacity remained. The logic was fatally flawed, but internally consistent. They believed shock could replace sustainability, that morale could overcome material, that a nation used to peace would break when confronted with sudden violence. These assumptions were shaped by Japan's own experiences and by a distorted view of American society. They did not understand that the United States did not fight wars the way Japan did. American strength did not lie in decisive opening blows. It lay in endurance, in logistics, in production, in the ability to absorb failure, adapt, and return stronger. Pearl Harbor did not sap American morale, it hardened it into something unbreakable. Once that happened, Japan's fate was sealed. From that point forward, every Japanese victory only delayed the inevitable. Every island taken required garrisons that could not be supplied. Every pilot lost reduced the quality of the next. Every ship sunk could not be replaced. The empire expanded faster than it could sustain itself. Pearl Harbor created momentum, but momentum without fuel dies. The deeper irony is that the very thing Japan feared most, economic strangulation, became reality because of the war it started. American submarines cut Japan's supply lines with ruthless efficiency. Oil stopped flowing. Food vanished. Industry collapsed. The embargo Japan sought to escape returned, multiplied 100-fold. By the final year of the war, Japan was fighting not to win, but to endure. Civilians were mobilized. Children trained with bamboo spears. Cities were emptied. Sacrifice became doctrine. The same mindset that made Pearl Harbor possible, where death was preferable to retreat, now consumed the nation itself. And yet, even in defeat, the legacy of Pearl Harbor endured. The attack permanently reshaped global politics. It ended American isolationism forever. It established the United States as a Pacific power. It changed naval warfare, proving aircraft carriers, not battleships, were the future. It redrew alliances, borders, and expectations. Pearl Harbor also became a warning studied by every military power that followed. It showed that surprise can win battles, but not wars. That economic pressure can provoke violence. That underestimating an enemy is often deadlier than underestimating their weapons. Most importantly, it revealed how nations can convince themselves that war is inevitable until they make it so. Japan did not attack Pearl Harbor because it wanted to destroy the United States. It attacked because it believed it could not survive without doing so. That belief was wrong, but it was real. And that is why Pearl Harbor still matters. Not as a story of sudden betrayal, but as a lesson in how fear, pride, and rigid thinking can trap entire nations into catastrophic decisions. The bombs that fell on December 7, 1941 were loud, but the silence that followed, the absence of alternatives, was far more dangerous. By the time Japan realized that Pearl Harbor had failed, there was no way back. The war would end only when nothing was left to fight with. That is the true cost of Pearl Harbor. Not just ships lost, not just lives taken, but the future that vanished the moment diplomacy gave way to desperation.